Thank you very much. Welcome to this Curtin University event in PSAS. It's really the first big event here in their new space, and it's a beautiful space. But we're very fortunate to have Jeffrey Sachs with us today. He's going to give us a presentation shortly. First of all, we're going to have a welcome to country from Simon Forrest, who is Curtin University's Elder in Residence. Simon, light the fires.
Kaya wanju, nan kwel Simon Forrest burungu, nitya wajak nyunga butya, nyababa butya wajak nyunga, nyaba manyua butya. My name is Simon Forrest. I'm a Wajak Nyunga man. This is Wajak Nyunga country. Wajak Nyunga country, this place. I am of this land. A Wajak Nyunga man. This is my mother's country. Nalak nija nini. Wajak boja nija walilap. This place here, Fremantle, this is the place where we are meeting. Nija walilap. Wago double yerigan needing. This place here, Fremantle, is part of the dreaming traps of the Wargle in the Swan River. My welcome involves a smoking ceremony, and I'll do that in a moment, and the smoke involves two elements, the warren, or sandalwood, and the bini, which is the gum or the resin off the balga or grass tree. The sandalwood is from my father's country to the north, Yamaji country. And the resin from the balga or grass tree is from my mother's country here, Wajak Nyunga country. And it's to cleanse this place and to welcome you to this place. May the koror, or the smoke, cleanse this place and bring the din, the good spirits here to this gathering. The one, the bini, kaya wanju wajak nyunga boja, 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 kaya wanju wajak nyunga boja. Kawanju wajak nyunga boja. Kawanju wajak nyunga boja. Kawanju wajak nyunga boja.
Wow, what a welcome. Absolutely incredible. And thank you. Thank you for all being here, and thank you to Oxfam and to Curtin University. Thank you for that extraordinary welcome to country, which I've never experienced before. And we'll always remember. Mayor, thank you very much for having me here at Fremantle. It's extremely exciting. And it's always a privilege to be together with people who care deeply about the issues, and I can already feel it in this room that there's no question that this is a group that is engaged in caring deeply about the future of our world, which is a complicated story, as we know. And the future of the world, I will not tell you about the future of the world, only a little bit about what the future might be, what some of our options are. I think that we're living in very complicated times right now. Lots of wonderful things can happen, and lots of very dangerous things are also happening, and so really finding our way through this is a matter of our energy, organization, commitment, and we're going to need a lot of good luck along the way. I'll talk about one part of this challenge, not a small part, but only one part of the challenge that we face collectively, and that is the continuing fight against extreme poverty. I won't say all that much about environmental issues today because I'm going to discuss that in detail tomorrow, but when we have discussion after my remarks, we can talk about any and all subjects, including all of the interconnections with the vast environmental challenges. And as I was discussing with your foreign minister this morning, there's no question that Australia plays a very huge role in all of these issues. It has a huge responsibility. It's a reason why I'm here, and also a reason why I feel very privileged to be here. So let's see if the clicker works. I'll start with some good news. I think good news that people know, and that is that there's progress globally in the fight against poverty. Now, one feels compelled to say at the start, especially after seeing the power of the culture here and the indigenous culture here, what we mean by poverty is a very complicated subject, and it certainly lends itself to lots of different meanings. There is no poverty of culture, of humanity in any part of the world. When we're talking about extreme poverty, I'm mostly talking about the material challenges of staying alive and having access to what technology can offer us in terms of healthcare, access to education, access to, at least potentially, a decent diet and nutrition for everybody on the planet. And we know that there are at least 1 billion people, arguably 2 billion people, in our 7.2 billion world population for whom daily survival remains a real struggle. And those are the people that I'll be focusing on in my remarks. Conventionally, with the World Bank as the keeper of this measurement of extreme poverty, we talk about an income threshold as a defining bar for extreme poverty. And the World Bank in recent years has used the measure of $1.25 a day, measured in purchasing power parity prices in 2008, a lot of jargon, but an economic level of household income that is deemed to be a threshold of poverty. That's not an entirely satisfactory measure, certainly, because we know that the challenge of survival is multidimensional. If a household is living above that income level, but living in a malaria transmission area without access to health care, I would call that household a household in extreme poverty, because it's a household facing a challenge of basic survival with needs not met. If a household is living above this threshold but without access to safe water or sanitation or other basic material needs or access to at least schooling for children, I would say that that's a household also in extreme poverty. So at the start, I want to say that we have a lot of definitional issues, and I'm going, therefore, to be talking about broad trends, not absolute specificity, but I think the broad trends are important. The evidence is that the share of the world's population facing this daily struggle for survival has been going down in recent decades. That's remarkable, important, good news, and a trend that can continue. And if we turn to the official data, as imperfect as they are, kept by the World Bank, they show that around 1990, in the developing countries, which are roughly 6/7 of the world's population, with the high-income world, including Australia, the United States, Western Europe, and so forth, constituting 1/7 of the world population. In the developing countries as a whole, roughly 43%, that's the estimate by the World Bank, 43% of households were living below this notional extreme poverty line. By 2010, that number had declined to 21%. That's what's shown in this figure from The Economist magazine recently, that the rate has gone from about 43% to around 21%. And then the indication is that that line can continue to fall to zero or to near zero by 2030. And the backdrop for us is that the World Bank, which is hardly a revolutionary organization, actually adopted last year in its development committee the goal of ending extreme poverty by the year 2030. I think that's a notable goal and a notable fact for the World Bank because it's a conservative body, but in reviewing the evidence, they felt that it was reasonable to adopt a bold, time-bound objective for the bank for the first time in the bank's history. And so we are operating in an environment in which there's now actually an official goal. And as Peter said just a moment ago, the UN General Assembly very likely will adopt next year in September 2015, in the context of the new Sustainable Development Goals, a global objective of the 193 member countries to end extreme poverty by this date, 2030. So the question is whether this is feasible, whether this is realistic, whether this is pie in the sky and crazy, and the answer is it could be all of those things. It depends what we make of it. But the idea that we could end extreme poverty certainly is a realistic proposition for us. If you look at where the poverty remains high, this is the most recent map of the World Bank. By the way, it's rather shocking. I'm the advisor to Secretary General on the Millennium Development Goals. The most recent data we have from the World Bank is 2010. That's pathetic, by the way. Absolutely unacceptable. I'm sure that Google could tell us hour by hour, and probably the National Security Agency of the United States could probably tell us minute by minute. And the World Bank can't tell us in 4 years. And so one of the things that we're pushing hard for next year is that we have at least an annual cycle of data. And I really regret that I'm reporting data that are many years out of date. But that's the best that we have right now. So what you can see is that the epicenter of global extreme poverty is tropical Africa. And I don't have a pointer here, but Africa, remember, if you look at the dark brown countries shaded in this map, which are countries where extreme poverty is 50% roughly of the population, you see that it's bounded by the set of countries in North Africa and in Southern Africa, and those are actually where the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn cut the continent. So we're really literally talking about, the geographic tropics as the area. I think that's not an insignificant fact. I've been arguing for 20 years that physical geography is one of the huge determinants of poverty. I have a hard time with my fellow economists in most parts of the world who believe that countries are aligned in alphabetical order, not on maps or in physical space. But the fact of the matter is that there are strong geographic correlates of poverty that we need to understand because they relate to physical features of daily life that affect overall economic development. The other place where you see relatively high poverty, but not like tropical Africa, is South Asia. This is the other high concentration of poverty. And roughly, at this point, I would guess around 40% of extreme poverty in the world, or 45% is in tropical Africa, and probably something around 40% is in South Asia. Now, South Asia is much more populous, and so even though the percentages in South Asia of poverty are considerably lower than in Africa, the absolute numbers are huge if you add up the poor in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and so forth. So these are the two critical areas. But as you know from this region, there are pockets of extreme poverty in Southeast Asia, certainly, in smaller island economies, and in other parts of the world. But the epicenter of this challenge is definitely tropical Africa. This has been, for as long as we know, the poorest part of the world, and for reasons that I'm going to describe in a few minutes, the part of the world that has had the most difficult time achieving economic development, and the place where we still face the most recalcitrant extreme poverty. Extreme poverty lines up pretty well with per capita GNP or GDP. So this is handy because we do have something like annual data for gross domestic product per person around the world. And this is the map shown in 2010 again to line up with the 2010 poverty rates. And you see that it's almost the same map. This is not based on household data as the poverty data are. This is based on national income accounts. But it tells pretty much the same story, that tropical sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest part of the world measured in national income per person and in household poverty. Of course, you can see why these would be closely related, and they are. And then South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia come next. And I think it's worthwhile noting on this map where we have some refinement, some of the other places where you have relatively low per capita income within their regions. Have a look at South America, for example. The two places with the lowest per capita income in South America are Bolivia and Paraguay. What's characteristic of those two countries? Of course, they're landlocked. If you look in Asia, you have Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, Laos, PDR, as relatively extremely poor places. Again, landlocked countries. This, again, is not a coincidence. Physical geography plays a huge role. Landlockedness is inherently a great difficulty for economic integration into global markets, and that isolation is one of the factors that leads to a perpetuation of extreme poverty. Now, to understand why we have poverty in the 21st century, in a world of vast wealth and vast technology, it's really useful to take a historical view. I think without the historical and the geographical view, it's impossible to understand this challenge. But with a historical and a geographical view, then the problems come into focus. And in my view, the solutions come into focus as well. I have to tell you, many economists disagree with almost everything I'm going to tell you. but I'm giving them time to catch up. Reality eventually will also infuse into the economics profession, and that will happen faster as professionals get out and have a look at different parts of the world, as Curtin University specializes in doing. And I think that's one of the great strengths of this university, and why I'm so happy that it's leading on sustainable development. From a historical perspective, what's crucial is to understand what we consider a modern economy, and even what we consider economic growth, is a wholly new phenomenon from a historical point of view that is just 200 years old, roughly in a way almost the same time period as Australia itself as a European nation. We know that as an indigenous population, the history of Australia is 70,000 years or more, but from the time of Britain's arrival here onward is almost the same date as modern economic growth. And when economic historians try to look back and understand the dynamics of global change of income, the lead macro historian who died a couple of years ago, who did the most work on this, Professor Angus Maddison, came up with a picture like this. And the picture estimates that for around 2,000 years, not too much changed in income per person. This is what's called gross world product per person. Add up all the production in the world, divide by the world population. And what you see is a quite flat line going from, going from 1 AD all the way to this little kink in the curve, and suddenly the curve of world output soars, and that's a 200-year phenomenon. And understanding how new this phenomenon is, in my mind, helps us understand why certain parts of the world remain in extreme poverty today. And it's not for the reasons that are usually given, at least in my opinion. So that sharp rise of income per capita, of course, has a very differentiated pattern in different parts of the world. And this is, again, a graph by the same macroeconomic historian, Professor Maddison, which shows the graph for several regions of the world. The top line in black that's us. That is Australia, Canada, and the United States, nicely called Western offshoots by Professor Maddison. I have to tell you, in truth, though it would look like Australia's line, it's basically the United States, I'm sorry to tell you, because it's just a weighted average of the 4 countries, including New Zealand, which doesn't move the curve too much. No problem with New Zealand, just a small population. And so since the beginning of modern economic growth, the Western offshoots, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, have been the richest part of the world consistently for 2 centuries. And at the very bottom of the curve, a line that almost didn't budge for 150 years and then slightly moved afterwards is sub-Saharan Africa, which is the line at the very bottom. And interestingly, the green line just above it, which was almost at the same level until recently and then turned upward, is Asia, not including Japan. Japan was the only industrializing country in Asia, in the Asian region, until the 1950s or so, And then Asia starts this remarkable growth spurt, which you know about all very, very well. So how does Madison have any idea what income was in 1450 or in 1200 or in 700? The answer is actually rather straightforward. And it is that we know pretty well how people lived for 2,000 years, meaning they were farmers in rural areas, period. Urban populations consistently were below 10% of the global population. And in most parts of the world, probably around 3 or 4%. Most of the world, in most of human history, after 10,000 before the present, were subsistence farmers. And up until around 1800, they were subsistence farmers. And a great observation made by John Maynard Keynes in the last century, the greatest economist of the 20th century, noted that if a Roman peasant had been brought to England around 1750, a Roman peasant from the Roman Empire had been brought to England around 1700 or 1750, he would have felt pretty much at home technologically. Not too much changed for centuries and centuries and centuries. And then everything changed. And everything changed in what we call the Industrial Revolution. And that is really the key to understanding all the rest. The Industrial Revolution really, really, truly started here. Started in England. And you can date it, you can time it, you can understand the modern growth. It really started with John Newcomen in 1712. He had a terrific idea. Instead of just burning coal for heat, you could burn coal in an enclosure with a piston and get motive force out of coal. He invented the steam engine. And of course, 70 years later, 60 years later, James Watt perfected, or not perfected, but dramatically improved Newcomen's design and patented the steam engine. And 1776 was the pivotal year for world history. Several important things happened in 1776. The most important of all, of course, was the patenting of Watt's steam engine. The second most important was the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. There was one more thing that happened in 1776. Edward Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was that small thing that happened in Philadelphia also, the publication of the Declaration of Independence. It really was a pivotal year. And I'm sure some important things were happening here as well at that point. But England, quite remarkably, and I think it's wonderful and complex and not so easy to tell the story, England invented the modern economy. And I view it as something like inorganic matter coming to life, because several things had to happen simultaneously to allow a breakthrough from thousands of years of essentially economic stasis to economic growth. And it was, most importantly, at a technological level, the ability to harness coal, a story crucial for Australia's development. But why did it happen there? And how did it get propelled? It was very fortunate for England that it had coal. The coal was nearby population centers. Coal had been used to heat homes for actually centuries. Pretty noxious, disgusting way to do it, but in a place where deforestation was already a crisis in the 17th century, coal was the fallback option. And now with coal, with iron ore, with a very clever entrepreneurial team of Watt and Bolton, with a patent law that gave them the opportunity to seek wealth out of this new invention, with a rudimentary rule of law, with iron ore deposits and a metallurgy sector, which was an unusual combination. Suddenly the pieces of the Industrial Revolution could come together for the first time in human history with Mr. Watt's brilliant invention. And what we know about economic history is that that changed everything. And most importantly for our discussion, what succeeded that first wave of unleashing the potential of coal energy and fossil fuel energy was a set of major technological waves that followed. And these are sometimes called Kondratiev waves in economic history, but several waves of major technological breakthroughs followed, from steam to rail and metallurgy that built on the steam engine, to electrification and modern chemistry in 100 years after Watt, to the development of an automobile society that built on the internal combustion inventions of the 1870s and 80s, and so forth. These waves propelled the countries in the lead of global economic growth into continued economic growth over 2 centuries. That much is the basis of creating the modern world economy. But most countries were not inventors of the modern economy. These great waves of invention took place in only a very small number of countries in the world. In England, in Western Europe, in the United States, the vast majority of these technologies developed for the first 150 years. Very, very few technologies developed anywhere else in the world. And so one can say that development in the rest of the world is what we would call a diffusion process. In a small part of the world, there was a dramatic burst of technological innovation that built on itself in a self-feeding manner, what economists call endogenous growth. And for the rest of the world, it was the opportunity to tap into these waves of technology. And of course, for most of us, for all of us here, I think, except if there are a few inventors in the room, we are users of what's invented somewhere else. I've never invented anything in my life, and I don't understand how most of it works. And I think that's true of most of us. And so most of the world achieves economic growth not through innovation, but through the diffusion of inventions from elsewhere. And the question that for an economic development analysis is, how does that diffusion take place? Where does it spread? And one way to look at that is to ask a question: when do different parts of the world, on average, reach income levels above extreme poverty? This is an exercise that I've been pursuing with colleagues in the last few years, and the map goes something like this. And I think it's very interesting for us to see this. The dark blue, which includes Australia and New Zealand and the United States and England and the Netherlands and actually Switzerland in there, that's all. Those are the countries that reached a level of $2,000 per person per year, the earliest, by 1860. That's the first wave of modern economic growth. Just a very small number of places. The second wave of economic growth is in the light blue. Canada jumps into the action. Western Europe jumps into the action. Sweden joins next. What's called the Southern Cone, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, by 1900 have reached that income level. But that's about all. Then, in the next 50 years, another part of the world reaches that level, mainly Eastern Europe, the whole vast territory of Russia and what was the Soviet Union, Japan, Venezuela. As of 1950, still less than half of the world had even reached that rudimentary level. Then the next wave from 1940 to 1980 are the countries in beige here. Most of South America and Central America, North Africa, the Persian Gulf, Western Asia, Eastern Europe around the Black Sea. But still notice not most of Asia. Even as late as 1980, most of Asia was still poor. Then, of course, came the most remarkable episode of modern history, the one that is affecting this country and affecting the whole world. Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978 and opened China to the world and to market economics. And what ensued in China is something we've never seen before. It's a basic proposition of diffusion that if you're far behind, you can run quite fast to catch up if the conditions are right. Well, China had fallen so far behind in 500 years of what I call one damn thing after another, because China really was at the peak of the world in 1433, and then they made the world's worst economic decision in all of history, which was scrapping their great fleet, closing the borders for 400 years. And the next time the borders were open, it was Britain shelling them to open their markets for the drug trade, my least favorite war of modern history. Can you imagine fighting a war to ensure the rights of free trade in opium, which was a great British idea of 1839. But China had one damn thing after another until Deng Xiaoping. And then it has achieved a doubling every 7 years. 5 doublings, 32-fold increase of income in the shortest period of time ever. And that's 1.3 billion people. So between 1980 and 2008, all of the rest of Asia reached this threshold level, except for 3 very landlocked countries: Mongolia, Afghanistan, and Nepal. Not accidental. These are really tough places. It's hard to be so surrounded with such long distances to international trade. And the other region of the world, the only other region of the world that did not achieve even that minimum threshold till then, was tropical Africa. So what we have is a diffusion process that spread in particular ways. And the field of economic development, in my opinion, if done properly, is really, in large part, the study of that diffusion. Why does it happen in certain ways? Why did certain blocks of regions quickly follow on England? Why did others take 50 years? Why did others take 100 years? And the answers are not so simple as is usually portrayed, because usually we boil this down: either they're lazy or they're corrupt. Those are the 2 categories for discussing poverty today. Or they're exploited, which has a lot of merit. But the real dynamics are a lot more complicated. And the real dynamics depend on physical geography, like being landlocked. They depend on other physical features, and they depend on politics as well. So what are some of those other variables? By the way, just to step back, this is an interesting graph which shows just within Europe the time to reach that 2000 threshold. And on the horizontal axis is the kilometers from London, and on the vertical axis is the date. And what it shows is that basically being close to the epicenter means that those ripples of growth reached you faster. So the big difference between France, Germany, Poland, Romania, Russia is physical distance. The epicenter of growth was centered in the North Atlantic, and it spread gradually, geographically, to the south and to the east. And it almost perfectly lines up on this line as a distance from London, explaining the timing, the delay until that threshold is reached. So what are some of the factors that made a difference? Well, coal is what brought us to the modern world. It's also what could wreck the world in the future. But it absolutely made the modern world economy without question. And so having coal made a big difference, huge difference. Places with coal deposits came faster in industrialization. That's true in New South Wales, it's true in the United States, it's true in the Ruhr Valley. Coal was one of the fundamental determinants. Check out, by the way, Africa and South America. There is no coal. That is not because of bad governance. That's because when coal was formed 100 million years ago, Australia and the United States and Western Europe were near the equator, where this huge biomass could be submerged and over geologic time turn into coal. That's all it is. And so Africa and South America and many other parts of the world could not industrialize. For 100 years, they did not have an energy source to do it. And the places that industrialized had coal, and those that did not have coal did not industrialize. Another fundamental factor is distance to international markets. Trade is the engine of diffusion. If you're close to markets, you can trade. If you're far away, it's more difficult. Australia and distance has always played a role, but of course, the vast majority of Australia's population hugs the coast. And that is true in the United States, it's true in Western Europe. But what this map shows, the black dots are ports, and we've measured where the population of different countries resides relative to ports. And the countries in red are places where the populations are far from ports physically, and the countries in blue or gray are close to ports. And Australia is actually in between. And the tropical Africa, you see, is almost entirely shaded red. This is quite extraordinary. Africa has the most inland population of any part of the world. Why? Two possibilities. Most likely it's because that's where food is best grown. For a lot of biophysical reasons, the coasts are either hyper-arid, dry as they are on the east coast of Africa, and it's only in the inland and the highlands where food production is better. And the other theory is because of the slave trade, pushed populations more towards the interior of the continent to avoid the slave trade. So countries that are farther from the port developed systematically later in terms of catching that wave of development. Disease epidemiology has also played a huge role, in my opinion. And from everything I see, from microeconomic studies and localized studies to global correlations, places that have unusually high disease burden are places where development, economic growth is delayed. Now, tropical Africa has by far the highest disease burden in the world, even adjusting for income levels. In other words, take comparably poor places in other parts of the world and look at the disease burden compared to that of tropical Africa. And you find that the disease burden, the death rates, the child mortality rates, and so forth are vastly higher. We actually can tell through good genetic sleuthing that this is not a modern phenomenon, but a long-term historical phenomenon. The way you can see that is through things like sickle cell anemia, which are genetic traits that are markers of high malaria burden, for example. And tropical Africa has by far the highest so-called hemoglobin anomalies in the world, suggesting that throughout history and prehistory, malaria has killed more people more intensively in Africa than in any other part of the world. I've been studying that myself for about 15 years now. And it turns out that not only does Africa have the climate that is most conducive to high malaria transmission, it has absolutely the nastiest mosquitoes in the whole world. Because malaria is transmitted by a genus called Anopheles, but there are about 100 species of Anopheles. The kind that Africa has uniquely bite people, as opposed to biting animals. And when you have an Anopheles species that bites animals, that breaks the human transmission. So the malaria ecology in Africa and other diseases as well is uniquely high, and it is almost the same map as extreme poverty. And I believe that this is a causal relationship. So I would add this to the list. High temperatures correlate with low economic development. And this is a relationship found in each hemisphere, across countries, within countries. And there are lots of reasons, but I think it's mostly related to agricultural productivity. And one more consideration that played a huge role, and that's politics. Certainly one can make the following simple generalization. There was no modern economic development in any country that was ruled externally from Europe. Now, checking your constitutional history, it is my understanding that Australia is not an exception to that, because basically home rule was already in effect from the middle of the 19th century. But not so in Africa and in South Asia. Latin America largely avoided this because of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States basically told Europe, stay out. And Europe tried to, the UK and others tried to meddle a few times, but the United States basically said, we'll do all the meddling, thank you. You stay out, we'll wreck South America on our own. And we did, but it was at least not colonized by Europe or through European imperial powers. The evidence that I've been able to adduce is that this dramatically holds that the era of imperial rule, which lasted roughly from about 1830 to 1960 in Africa and Asia, held back economic development by some decades. And the main reason, I would argue, is that it held back education and basic public health. because the imperial powers did not care to educate local populations. And it was only with independence starting after World War II that these countries had the chance for the economic breakthrough. So all of those are factors that statistically do a wonderful job of explaining the timing and the diffusion of modern economic growth. And you can see that for sub-Saharan Africa, the structural features have been tremendously debilitating. Africa has a very difficult physical geography. It has lacked energy resources. It lacked coal and missed the coal revolution entirely. It has a massive disease burden. It suffered 70 years of imperial rule, about 70 to 100 years, depending on when independence came. But from around 1880 to sometime between 1957 and 1994, with the end of apartheid, one could say. And that was also a tremendous liability. Now, what does one make of such an analysis? Is that only historical curiosity to argue about? I would say no. My own view is that such an analysis helps us to identify what are the problems. Why are some places not developing and others developed? Why are some places stuck? And that's been my opinion for all of this period and my advice to the United Nations during the Millennium Development Goal period of the last 14 years. I've argued that the key to unlocking economic development in the places that are still stuck involve a targeted differential diagnosis to understand what's going on here, what's special, what needs to be addressed, what investments need to be made to make a breakthrough that by now 6/7 of the world has achieved. And the reason I put so much stress on extreme poverty is twofold. One is from a moral point of view. It's the life and death kind of poverty. It's really worth focusing on. It's the most urgent crisis in the world. It's millions of deaths per year. We don't pay attention because the poor don't count. They're not counted. These are not headline issues. But it's 6.5 million kids still dying before their 5th birthday of absolutely stupid reasons. So it's a moral issue. The other reason to pay attention is that once you reach that threshold of passing by extreme poverty, then the forces of economic growth tend to be perpetuating. In other words, I've said in The End of Poverty, when I wrote about this, that it's like getting onto the first rung of the ladder of development. Once you're on that rung, you can climb. Before you're on it, you can't climb the ladder. So there is really a special focus to helping countries get to that first rung of the ladder, after which they can climb the ladder. I believe this requires targeted, pragmatic investments in key areas based on local conditions and diagnosis. And I would say that it's the following 5 pillars. Not easy, but definable, and something that can be reduced to practical programming. The first is human capital. That is developing education, health, skills. Of course, this is an investment opportunity. It's every country's most important investment. It's the kind of investment that did not take place at all in much of Africa during the colonial period. Second is raising agricultural productivity. A fundamental part of this transition out of extreme poverty is being able to feed the population, and not with 100% of the population feeding itself as subsistence farmers, but with a smaller proportion of the population productive enough to feed the rest of the population. So raising agricultural productivity. Third, of course, is the urban side of the story, industrial and service sector. and that requires its own range of basic economic tools. Fourth is infrastructure, especially transport and power. Transport and power are completely fundamental. You cannot develop without electricity. This is a basic point. And before 1870 or so, you couldn't develop without coal. And yet there are still an estimated 1.4 billion people that do not have electricity. And for them, there is no development. There's no technology that can carry them out of extreme poverty. Even a pump for water, for refrigeration, for safe food, for a cold chain, for vaccines, none of it's possible without electrification. And without roads and ports and without trade, there's no way to participate in the modern economy. You're stuck in subsistence. And that's a huge issue for landlocked countries, as I've been indicating. And finally, one needs functioning government, of course. And functioning government is partly made possible by having the basics of these first four, and partly, of course, through directed efforts. Government costs money. Government requires resources, training, management systems, information systems, and so forth. And this is also very difficult under conditions of extreme poverty. But the point I would say is that the more favored the geography and the underlying conditions, the more likely and easier it is to meet these conditions. The gaps are quite small. But if you're landlocked, if you're 1,000 miles from the coast, if you're in a malaria zone, if you have other deeper impediments, if you have no modern energy source, and you're living in subsistence, then you have a bigger problem. And that is where the gaps have to be filled. Now, there are two ways to fill the gaps. One is through improved technologies, and the other is through development assistance. And that's where the story is leading us. First, let me say that we have wind in our sails because of the information revolution now. This is really the single most powerful tool we have to be able to say we can be the generation to end extreme poverty. Because we are the lucky inheritors of now 55 years of Moore's Law. It's actually 57 years of Moore's Law. For 57 years since the first integrated circuit was made, the transistor count has been doubling, as Gordon Moore already observed in 1965. So Intel had 2 or 3 transistors on its first integrated circuit. On its most recent integrated circuit last year, there are 5 billion transistors. This has been put to the most important use for modern civilization, which is, of course, the ability to stream movies on your phone. We have reached the pinnacle beyond anything imaginable before. But we could even achieve some lesser targets like health for all, education for all, business models, finance for all, if we push aside, in the US it's Netflix, I don't know what it is here, in order to use our information technology for these purposes. I'm hugely optimistic about this. And I love the fact that we have gone from 20,000 subscribers of cell phones in 1980, 20,000, to 7 billion now. And I can tell you, every village that I visit anywhere in the world, anywhere, no matter how remote, now has connectivity. By the way, I just have to share with you the image because it was remarkable. We were at 4,000 meters in a mountain pass with my family in Bhutan last year. And it's a mystical, marvelous country. And we were camping one night next to a monastery. And at about 6 in the evening, we heard this beautiful chants. And so we went to look, and in the little chapel, the monks were on their knees reading the Buddhist scriptures and chanting, and it was absolutely magical. And the head monk, a young man in saffron robes and shaved head, greeted us and welcomed us and walked outside, and the stars were so bright, and it was just phenomenal. And all of a sudden, and he reached into his robe, pulled out his Samsung Galaxy, and started talking on the phone. And I said, okay, complete connectivity. We've reached it everywhere. And this is a reality that I think is transformative for the world. And we also have the ability to bring electrification everywhere as well. And one of the most important reasons is that photovoltaic costs have fallen by a factor of 100 since 1977, from $77 a watt in 1977 down to about 70 cents a watt in 2013. This is an absolutely phenomenal breakthrough that makes it possible to envision mass electrification, even in microgrids or purely distributed electricity. And this is the source of the progress of the Millennium Development Goals. And I'm a big fan of goals. I'm a big fan of setting objectives, and my experience is with the Millennium Development Goals, the mere fact of the goals have made a huge, huge difference of directing attention and energy. And I always like to refer to the wisdom of JFK on this when he was pursuing peace with the Soviet Union in 1963 and pursuing it successfully in the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. He had this wonderful bit of management leadership advice. He said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And I believe that's what the Millennium Development Goals have helped to do, and what the Sustainable Development Goals that are to be promulgated next year aim to do as well. And just a couple of the successes of the Millennium Development Goals: malaria has peaked and now come down sharply in Africa through a targeted, focused program of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. This is a human effort directed towards a purpose. It didn't just happen. A goal was set, a strategy was put in place, money was mobilized, resources went into malaria-stricken places, and the death rates have come down now by more than half. And similarly with the AIDS pandemic, which was running completely out of control at the time the Millennium Development Goals were adopted. Now the incidence of the disease peaked and is coming down significantly, and the deaths from AIDS are also falling significantly. And with further technological breakthroughs, what's called treatment as prevention, the idea of mass treatment of all infected individuals, it may be possible sooner rather than later to break transmission of the disease in the epicenter in Africa. And yet, we haven't made it to where we need to be. And I believe that this is not a technological crisis anymore. It's certainly not an economic crisis. It's not a financial crisis. It is, as Pope Francis has said, a moral crisis. And I believe that Pope Francis said it the best of all in his exhortation last fall called Evangelii Gaudium, when he talked about the globalization of indifference. Because this, I find, is the most fundamental barrier that remains. There are no longer any massive technological barriers to breaking extreme poverty. But we are facing a crisis of will, even in the face of the successes that have been achieved. And you know it very well here because we're living through it in Australia this week. And it's really not acceptable. ODA, official development assistance, as a percent of gross national income, basically gross national product or GDP, has been essentially flat for decades if you look at all of the donor countries. This despite promises at least 100 times solemnly made to reach the 0.7% of GNI target. Is it too much for us Western offshoots to use a little bit of our vast wealth, less than 1%, for the purpose of these targeted investments? I can't tell you, but I can certainly tell Oxfam, which is one of the heroes in this effort, the struggle that it takes to try to mobilize tiny fractions of 1% of development assistance from places who have everything that they could possibly want and need. We're just stuck, despite the promises. The most recent promise of the Millennium Development Goals, the two most important, were in 2002 in the Monterey Financing for Development Conference, where paragraph 42, I think it is, said that we urge all developed countries that have not done so to make concrete efforts towards the internationally agreed target of 0.7% of GNI. And the second was at Gleneagles G8 Summit in 2005 in the UK, when the commitment was made to double aid to Africa by 2010. And of course, nothing like it happened at all. And we've made excuse after excuse. Aid has leveled off. The United States is a major culprit in this. The U.S., which is so rich, we absolutely haven't the slightest idea what to do with all the wealth we have, is down here at 0.19% of GDP. It's really a complete travesty when you consider that the United States spends about 5% of GDP on the military and on these stupid wars that absolutely accomplish nothing except killing people. And yet, when it turns to saving people, it's extraordinarily difficult to mobilize any effort. But this is Australia. Australian aid, as you know, in real terms shown in the red, is now falling significantly. I had a chance to talk with your foreign minister this morning. I expressed my view that this is not acceptable for this country. The world needs Australia. This is one of the richest places on the entire planet. It's blessed with wonderful people and wonderful resources, and it shows up in unbelievably high incomes. And you have a few billionaires also, and you unfortunately exported one of them to the rest of the English-speaking world. And they ought to do something more than they're doing right now. It's really, really not acceptable, in my opinion. This is another picture of Australian ODI, how it peaked in 2011-12 and is coming down. And by the way, it's interesting to know that the argument, well, we have an austerity budget, is no argument at all. Completely unacceptable. Here we're talking about tiny fractions of 1% of national income. And if you want proof that it's absolutely an irrelevant argument, look at what the UK has done. And quite interesting, because it's a conservative government, and the UK, during a tough austerity budget over the last 5 years, has raised its aid level to 0.7% of GDP, even in the midst of this. The current government's budget has no excuse, in my opinion. It has no logic. It is not befitting this country. It does not befit the values of this country. And there's no logic for it whatsoever, because it would be absolutely possible to accommodate more aid within that budget. Finally, let me say, one more word, two more words. What are the biggest obstacles in addition to the globalization of indifference? There really are two huge obstacles confronting Africa, which for me is the most difficult and urgent place still in the world scene. One of them is that Africa is extraordinarily vulnerable to global climate change, because Africa is overwhelmingly a dryland region. It's a rain-fed agricultural region. It has fragile ecosystems, and it is absolutely in the bullseye of human-induced climate change. I worry about this morning, noon, and night. That's why we have to combine the fight against poverty with the fight for environmental sustainability. This is not a choice. This is an inevitable linking of these objectives. That's why sustainable development truly is the defining concept of our age. There's no escaping it. It's not being nice, it's being logical about our survival. And so number one challenge is violating the planetary boundaries. And number two, this is what happens when drought occurs, or I could have shown you the war pictures throughout Africa. It is well known and well proved: drought, conflict, drought, conflict. And this is the number one worry that I have. The second that I want to mention is population. Remember that of those 5 pillars, I said that human capital was the first. And that is a mix of what's called the demographic transition and investment in the health, nutrition, education, and skills of every child. The demographic transition, of course, means bringing fertility rates down to near replacement level at the same time that you bring mortality rates down to minimum levels. Africa is in a demographic path that is absolutely untenable, and that is that fertility rates remain as high as 5 to 7 children per mother across the African countries. Mortality remains high, but not high enough. I don't mean high enough in that sense, high enough statistically to offset that. So the net effect is a startling rise of population. Sub-Saharan Africa had 179 million people in 1950 by the UN estimate. Now it has 950 million. On the so-called medium fertility trajectory of the United Nations, in 2100 there will be 3.8 billion people in tropical Africa. This is not compatible with sustainable development. And so this whole transition of health, education, family planning, adoption of modern contraception, women's empowerment is a completely vital component of the overall transition and transformation that is needed. There's nothing mysterious about it. If you want the number one policy implication of that, help girls stay in school, period. Help girls finish high school. You'll transform the whole society. And so we need to get serious about these things. That's where development aid plays such a huge role, in health, in education, in meeting basic needs, in ensuring access to family planning and contraception, in helping girls and boys stay in school. It makes a difference. In the end of the day, ending extreme poverty is within reach. We have momentum. We have technology. The question for us is whether we have the will. Thank you very much.